Elijah Carter sat quietly, waiting for his moment. He wasn't just another teenager on his way to a chess tournament. He was a prodigy, about to take on the world's best. But as airport security zeroed in on him with suspicious eyes, Elijah realized this journey would test more than just his chess skills. What he didn't know was that the game of life, much like chess, would require moves far more complicated than the ones he had mastered on the board. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Elijah Carter sat quietly in the car as it pulled up to the bustling airport terminal. His mother, Maya, was beside him, her face etched with a mixture of pride and concern. At 15, Elijah had already made a name for himself in the chess world. Today, they were heading to one of the most important tournaments of his life, where he would compete against the best international players. The stakes were high, but Elijah wasn't nervous, at least not about chess. The game came naturally to him. What concerned him was everything outside the chessboard, the world that didn't always understand a quiet, bookish black boy who preferred chess pieces to video games. Maya looked at her son, her eyes softening. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ready as always, Mom," he said. They stepped out of the car, and Elijah hoisted his backpack over his shoulder. Inside was his beloved chess set, a book on strategy he had been reading for the 4th time, and a notebook filled with hand-drawn chessboards, positions, and tactics. To most, Elijah looked like any other teenager, but Maya knew better. She had watched him grow into a prodigy, a boy with a mind far older than his years. As they entered the terminal, the airport's chaos washed over them. Families rushing to gates, business people glued to their phones, travelers navigating lines of security checkpoints. Elijah moved calmly through it all, his eyes always scanning, observing, much like he did during a chess match. His mother, as always, walked beside him, her protective instincts heightened in places like this. "Stay close, Elijah," Maya said as they neared the security line. "Let's get through this quickly so we can relax before the flight." Elijah nodded again, though something about the line of uniformed security officers made him feel uneasy. He tried to focus on the upcoming tournament, imagining his opening moves for his first match. He had been preparing for this moment for months, studying his opponent's strategies, practicing long hours into the night. Chess was where Elijah found peace, where nothing mattered but the next move. Here, in the chaos of an airport, that peace felt distant. As they reached the front of the line, an officer waved them forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and stern-faced. His name tag read Briggs. Elijah noticed the way Officer Briggs's eyes moved over him, lingering a bit too long, narrowing slightly as if trying to assess something beyond the surface. "Step forward, please," Briggs said, his tone formal but edged with something colder, something that made Elijah's heart beat a little faster. Maya noticed it too. "We're just heading to a chess tournament," she said, her voice polite but firm. "My son's got an important event in a few hours." Officer Briggs looked at her briefly before his gaze returned to Elijah. "And what's in the bag?" he asked, gesturing toward Elijah's backpack. Elijah glanced at his mother, then back at the officer. "Just my chess set and some books," he said, his voice steady despite the growing discomfort. "Mind if we take a look?" Briggs said, but it wasn't really a question. He gestured for Elijah to step aside, directing him toward a small table off to the side of the main line. Maya followed closely, her eyes narrowing as she watched the officer. "Is there a problem?" Maya asked, trying to keep her voice calm, but the tension in her shoulders was visible. She had experienced this before, the extra scrutiny, the unnecessary questions, the assumption that something was wrong simply because of how they looked. "No problem, ma'am. Just a routine check," Briggs said, though his expression betrayed a different story. Elijah placed his backpack on the table and unzipped it, revealing the neatly organized chess set and his book. Briggs rummaged through it, picking up the chess pieces as if they were suspicious objects. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he expected to find something hidden beneath the surface. Elijah stood there quietly, his face expressionless, though inside he could feel the slow burn of frustration. He had been through this kind of thing before. People who didn't know him, didn't know what he was capable of, always assuming the worst. He was used to proving himself, but it never got easier. After what felt like an eternity, Briggs put the pieces back in the bag and zipped it up. "You can go," he said finally, but his tone wasn't apologetic. It was dismissive, as if Elijah had somehow still done something wrong, just by being there. Maya exhaled sharply, but said nothing. She grabbed Elijah's hand, squeezing it tightly as they walked away from the table and toward the gate. Her face was set, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elijah could feel the anger radiating from her, but she stayed silent, not wanting to cause a scene. As they sat down near the gate, Maya finally spoke, her voice low. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "It's fine, Mom," Elijah said, though the knot in his stomach told him it wasn't. "It's over now." But as he sat there, waiting for the flight to be called, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Moments like that didn't just disappear. They lingered, stayed with him, a constant reminder that no matter how good he was at chess, no matter how much he accomplished, there were people who would always see him a certain way. Different, suspicious. He pulled out his chessboard and began setting up the pieces, focusing on the familiar movements. The airport, the people, the officer, they all faded into the background. The chessboard was his sanctuary, where race and prejudice didn't matter. All that mattered were the moves he made. As he set up the pieces, preparing for an imaginary game, Elijah glanced at his mother. She was staring off into the distance, her jaw still tight. He wished he could say something to make her feel better, to take away the weight she carried for both of them. But instead, he just focused on the board, because in chess, there were rules. And in life, the rules weren't always so clear. The sterile white walls of the airport terminal seemed to close in on Elijah as he and his mother sat in silence, waiting for their flight. The incident with Officer Briggs was supposed to be over, but it still clung to Elijah, lingering in the air like a faint, unshakable odor. Maya's fingers twitched in her lap, and Elijah knew that her silence spoke louder than any words she could say. He wanted to move on, to dive into the familiar world of chessboard strategies and grandmasters' biographies. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the tournament ahead, his mind kept circling back to that moment. Briggs' questioning. The way he had looked at him as though waiting for Elijah to make a wrong move. He wasn't supposed to be thinking about this, not right now. "Mom," Elijah finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm fine." Maya turned to look at him, her expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "You shouldn't have to be, Eli," she said quietly. "None of this is fine." Her words hung in the air, and Elijah had no response. He knew she was right. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. But he had learned long ago that life wasn't always fair. The world beyond the chessboard was full of unpredictable variables, and the only way he knew how to deal with them was to keep moving forward. Elijah pulled his chessboard from his backpack, hoping that familiar ritual would ease the tension swirling inside him. He carefully arranged the pieces, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. The world shrank as he placed the pawns, knights, and bishops into their starting positions. Here, in this world of black and white squares, everything made sense. The rules were simple, and every move had a purpose. The board was where he was in control, where nothing else mattered but his next decision. He had just begun working through a series of opening moves when he felt eyes on him. Elijah glanced up and noticed Officer Briggs standing a short distance away, talking with another security guard. He wasn't looking directly at Elijah, but there was something about his stance, something that suggested his attention was still focused on them. Elijah swallowed the frustration that bubbled up inside him. Wasn't it enough that they had been searched and questioned already? What more could Briggs possibly want? His mother had always told him that the best way to handle these situations was to stay calm, stay polite, and never let them see you lose your cool. But Elijah was starting to wonder why it was always up to people like him to stay calm, to make sure they didn't provoke anyone's assumptions. "He's still watching us," Maya said quietly, following Elijah's gaze. Her voice was low, but there was a hard edge to it. Elijah said nothing, but his hand clenched a chess piece a little tighter. He set it down with more force than necessary, the small sound seeming too loud in the quiet corner where they sat. "You don't have to play their game, Eli," his mother said, her voice softening. "You don't owe anyone anything." Elijah looked at her, wanting to believe that. But he had learned a long time ago that he had to be careful. Careful not to stand out too much, not to speak out too loudly. Even in chess, a game that was supposed to be about intellect and skill, Elijah had encountered opponents who couldn't hide their surprise when he beat them. As if it was unexpected, as if he didn't fit their picture of what a chess prodigy should look like. His thoughts were interrupted when a man approached, carrying a tablet and wearing a slightly rumpled suit. His graying hair and thick glasses gave him the appearance of someone more comfortable in a library than an airport. He smiled awkwardly as he stopped in front of them. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hesitant but friendly. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you Elijah Carter?" Elijah blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. I am." The man's face lit up. "I thought so. I'm David Harrison, a journalist covering the tournament. I've been following your career for a while now. It's an honor to meet you in person." Maya glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. She wasn't sure whether to trust this man, given the way their day had been going. But something about the way he spoke, the genuine enthusiasm in his voice, made her relax, just a little. Elijah nodded politely. "Thank you." "I'm sorry to interrupt you," Mr. Harrison continued, glancing between Elijah and his mother. "But I wanted to say that I'm really looking forward to seeing you play. Your match strategies are incredible, especially for someone your age. You've got a real gift." Elijah didn't know how to respond. Compliments like these often felt awkward to him, but he appreciated the man's sincerity. "Thanks," he said again, feeling a little more at ease. Harrison smiled warmly, then looked down at the chessboard in front of Elijah. "Working on a new opening?" "Just running through some old strategies," Elijah replied. "Trying to clear my head before the flight." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting slightly as he seemed to notice the tension between Maya and Elijah. His expression sobered as he glanced toward the security area where Officer Briggs still stood. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The look on their faces told him enough. "It's tough," Harrison said softly. "I've seen it before, but you've got something special, Elijah. Don't let them take that away from you." Elijah looked up at the man, surprised by the quiet conviction in his words. There was no pity in his voice, just understanding. It was something Elijah hadn't expected to find in a stranger, but it was comforting. "I won't," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I won't let them." Harrison gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Good, I'll be rooting for you." With a quick nod, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Elijah and Maya to sit in the silence once again. Maya watched him go, her expression softening. "Seems like you've got people in your corner, Eli." Elijah looked down at the chessboard, running his fingers over the smooth surface of the pieces. For the first time since the incident with Officer Briggs, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe he didn't have to play their game after all. But as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Elijah knew that the game was far from over. The real test was yet to come, on and off the chessboard. And this time, he was determined to win, not by proving himself to others, but by staying true to who he was. Elijah sat quietly in his airplane seat, staring out the window as the world below shrank into a patchwork of green and brown. The hum of the engines was a low, constant background noise, but it did nothing to calm the swirling thoughts in his mind. Across the aisle, Maya was reading a magazine, though Elijah could tell by the way she occasionally glanced over at him that her attention wasn't on the words. She was still upset. He could feel it in the tension that seemed to hang between them. He couldn't shake the incident at the airport either, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't just about Officer Briggs or the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for no reason. It was the way everyone had watched, eyes wide and silent, as though they were afraid to intervene. A few passengers had looked sympathetic, but no one had spoken up. No one had said, "This isn't right," or asked why a 15-year-old boy with a chess set was being singled out. Elijah knew he wasn't the first person to experience something like this, and sadly, he wouldn't be the last. But it didn't make it any easier. As the clouds rolled by outside, he thought about how many times his mother had told him stories about facing similar prejudice growing up. He had heard about her being followed in stores, questioned when she had done nothing wrong, and how she had always remained composed, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had passed that lesson on to him. Stay calm, stay respectful, never give them a reason to say you were anything less than perfect. It was exhausting. Eli, his mother's voice broke through his thoughts. How are you feeling? Elijah turned to look at her, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm okay, Mom, just thinking. Maya sighed softly. You know, it's not fair that you have to think about things like this, but I want you to remember something. She paused, looking him in the eye. What happened back there says a lot more about them than it does about you. You don't have to carry their ignorance. Elijah nodded, though the knot in his chest remained. He wanted to believe that, but how could he not carry it? Everywhere he went, it seemed like there was always something, some reminder that people like him had to be extra careful, extra aware. Because one wrong move could mean the difference between being seen as a threat or simply being invisible. His mother's words echoed in his mind, but the reality of the world they lived in weighed heavily on his young shoulders. The flight landed smoothly, and soon Elijah and Maya were moving through another airport, though this one felt different. There was no incident at security, no suspicious glances cast their way. Yet Elijah still couldn't help but feel wary. His upcoming matches loomed large in his mind, but so did the events from earlier. He had to focus, he knew that. The tournament was what mattered right now. But it was hard to shake the feeling that the world was always watching, always waiting for him to slip up. As they arrived at the hotel, Elijah was relieved to finally be away from the constant movement of airports and strangers. The tournament wasn't until the next day, and he wanted nothing more than to spend the evening practicing, going over his strategies, and mentally preparing for the matches ahead. Why don't you rest a bit? Maya suggested as they settled into their hotel room. You've had a long day. Elijah knew she was right, but rest didn't come easy to him, especially not with so much weighing on his mind. Instead, he set up his chessboard on the small table by the window and began running through opening sequences. The familiar patterns of pawns and knights moving across the board helped center him, pulling him back into the world of logic and strategy that he loved. Just as he was about to dive into another round of analysis, there was a knock at the door. Maya answered it, and to Elijah's surprise, it was Mr. Harrison, the journalist from the airport. I hope I'm not interrupting, Mr. Harrison said, smiling warmly. I wanted to stop by and see how you're doing. Elijah looked up from his chessboard, surprised by the gesture. Most journalists he'd encountered were more interested in asking questions about his matches, but Harrison seemed different, genuinely concerned about more than just the chess. Come on in, Maya said, gesturing to the chair near Elijah. We were just settling in. Harrison nodded gratefully and took a seat. His eyes fell on the chessboard, where pieces were still set up in mid-game. I see you're already preparing, he said, his tone light. You really don't take a break, do you? Elijah shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. Chess helps me think. Understandable, Harrison said, his voice softening. After everything that happened today, I imagine you've got a lot on your mind. Maya sat down across from them, her expression carefully neutral, though Elijah could tell she was still wary of how much to share with a stranger. I couldn't believe what I saw back at the airport, Harrison continued. It was wrong. Plain and simple, and I just wanted you to know that not everyone out there is okay with what happened. Elijah appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't like he expected people to jump in and defend him. It just wasn't how the world worked. But hearing someone acknowledge it, especially someone outside his own experience, was strangely comforting. Thanks, Elijah said quietly. I'm used to it, though. Harrison frowned, and for a moment, silence filled the room. He seemed to be struggling with something, as if trying to find the right words. That's the problem, isn't it? He finally said. You shouldn't have to be used to it. No one should. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He had heard this before from teachers and well-meaning people, but the reality remained. Being used to it didn't mean it hurt any less. It just meant he had learned to live with it. Harrison shifted in his seat, clearly wanting to change the mood. Look, I don't want to pry, but if you ever feel like talking about it, about anything, it could help others to hear your story. I could write something, share what happened. Or maybe, he hesitated, maybe we could focus on your chess, on who you are as a player. Let the world see you for what you really are. Elijah considered his words carefully. The idea of sharing his story was tempting, but he didn't want to be reduced to a victim in someone else's narrative. He had worked too hard to be defined by anything other than his love for the game. I appreciate it, Elijah said, his voice steady. But I'd rather focus on chess. That's who I am. What happened today, that's not all of me. Harrison smiled, understanding exactly what Elijah meant. Fair enough, he said, but just know you've got people rooting for you. As Harrison left, Elijah felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't that the events of the day had magically disappeared or that the world had suddenly become fair. But knowing that there were people like Harrison who saw him for who he truly was gave him the strength to keep going. Maya, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, reached over and squeezed Elijah's hand. You've got this, Eli, she said softly. You always have. Elijah nodded, looking down at his chessboard once more. The pieces were still in mid-game, and the next move was his. As he adjusted a pawn, he realized that chess, much like life, wasn't just about the moves in front of you. It was about thinking ahead, seeing the long game, and never letting anyone take away your ability to choose your own path. The day of the tournament arrived, and the atmosphere in the grand hall was electric. The room buzzed with excitement as players from around the world prepared for their matches. There was an air of quiet intensity, the kind that only comes when great minds are set to collide on a battlefield of logic and strategy. For most of the competitors, it was a day like any other. Just another tournament, another opportunity to prove themselves. But for Elijah Carter, this was different. He had faced many challenges in his short life, but this tournament felt like the culmination of all of them. It wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that had been tested and tarnished in recent days. The airport incident still lingered in his mind, like an unwanted shadow that he couldn't quite shake off. But today, he was determined to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that his worth extended far beyond how the world saw him. As Elijah and Maya entered the tournament hall, they were greeted by rows of tables neatly arranged with chessboards, timers, and scorecards. Spectators milled about, some already seated in the gallery, whispering excitedly about the players they hoped to see in action. Elijah noticed some familiar faces, other young prodigies like himself, veterans of the game, and grandmasters whose names he had read about in chess magazines. Maya, always composed, leaned over and whispered, "You've got this, Eli. Don't let anything distract you today." Elijah nodded, his focus already shifting inward. His mother's support was his anchor, but once he sat down at that table, it was just him and the board. Everything else, the noise, the pressure, the expectations, would fade away. They found his designated table, and Elijah began to set up his pieces, methodically placing each one in its starting position. He loved the ritual of it. The way the white king stood next to his queen, the knights perched on either side of the bishops, the pawns lined up like soldiers awaiting their commander's orders. It was familiar, comforting. Here, everything followed a predictable pattern. Here, there was control. As Elijah finished arranging his pieces, he saw Mr. Harrison enter the hall. The journalist spotted him and gave a small nod of encouragement from across the room. Elijah felt a flicker of warmth. Someone believed in him. It wasn't much, but sometimes that was all you needed. Soon, Elijah's first opponent arrived. A boy named Victor from a country halfway around the world. Victor was known for his aggressive playing style, always going for the kill early in the match. He sat down across from Elijah, his sharp blue eyes sizing him up. There was a brief, polite handshake, and then the clock was started. From the very first move, Elijah knew Victor wasn't going to make this easy. The boy opened with a fierce gambit, pushing his pawns forward in a flurry of attacks, clearly intending to overwhelm Elijah quickly. But Elijah didn't flinch. He had studied Victor's style before, and he knew exactly how to counter it. With careful precision, he defended against the initial onslaught, trading pieces when necessary, but never letting Victor dictate the pace of the game. As the match progressed, the tension in the room began to build. Other games were well underway, but Elijah could feel eyes on his board. Spectators were starting to gather, intrigued by the quiet, calculated intensity of the game. Elijah tuned them out, his mind locked on the intricate patterns unfolding before him. Victor's impatience began to show. He was used to overpowering his opponents early, but Elijah had neutralized his attacks with almost surgical precision. Now, Victor was left to rethink his strategy, and Elijah saw his chance. He seized control of the center of the board, advancing his pawns and positioning his rooks for an assault. Every move was deliberate, a piece of a larger, more complex puzzle that only Elijah could see fully formed in his mind. Minutes turned into hours as the game wore on. The pressure was palpable, but Elijah remained composed. His breathing was steady, his hands moved fluidly, and his mind was as sharp as ever. Maya, sitting in the gallery, watched with bated breath. She knew this wasn't just about winning a match. This was about Elijah showing the world what he was capable of. Finally, after a grueling battle of wits, Elijah made his move. His queen slid across the board, delivering a checkmate that left Victor stunned and the crowd murmuring in awe. The clock stopped, and Elijah's victory was announced. A quiet smile crossed his face as he shook Victor's hand again, this time with the respect of someone who had earned it. As Elijah stood, he noticed Mr. Harrison jotting notes furiously from his seat in the audience. The journalist gave him a thumbs up, and Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had won, but more importantly, he had played the game his way, calm, strategic, and true to himself. Elijah moved through the rounds with similar focus and determination. His next few opponents proved just as challenging, but Elijah's ability to adapt and outthink them carried him forward. Each match was a new puzzle, a new set of problems to solve, and Elijah reveled in the complexity of it all. But as he advanced deeper into the tournament, he could feel the weight of the expectations growing. The more matches he won, the more people noticed. Whispers of his skill spread through the hall, and soon spectators were gathering specifically to watch him play. The attention was flattering, but it also came with a sense of responsibility that Elijah hadn't fully anticipated. The final match arrived quicker than he expected. His opponent was an older boy, already an international master with a reputation for his aggressive, unpredictable style. As they sat down across from each other, Elijah could feel the tension crackling in the air. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was the culmination of everything he had worked for. The match started slowly, both players feeling each other out, testing the waters before committing to a strategy. Elijah could sense his opponent's impatience, just as he had with Victor. The older boy wanted to strike fast, to catch Elijah off guard, but Elijah was prepared. He had learned long ago that patience was the most powerful weapon in chess. Rushing would only lead to mistakes, and Elijah wasn't about to give his opponent that advantage. As the game progressed, Elijah found himself in a precarious position. His opponent had managed to trap one of his rooks, and the balance of power seemed to tip slightly in the older boy's favor. Elijah's mind raced, calculating every possible move, every potential outcome. He knew he couldn't afford to panic, not now, not when he was so close. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. His opponent's aggression had left his own defenses exposed, and Elijah saw the opening. It was risky, but if he played his cards right, he could turn the tide. With a series of bold moves, Elijah launched a counterattack, sacrificing one of his bishops to break through his opponent's defenses. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the older boy realized what was happening. Elijah had outmaneuvered him, trapping his king in a series of moves he hadn't seen coming. Finally, after a tense few moments, Elijah delivered the finishing blow, a checkmate that brought the room to life with applause. As the tournament came to a close, Elijah was declared the winner. His final victory had been hard-fought, but it was undeniable. He had earned his place among the best. Yet, as Elijah stood there, holding the trophy in his hands, he felt a strange sense of calm. The tournament had been a challenge, yes, but it hadn't been the true test. That had happened days before in the airport. And as he looked out at the crowd, At his mother, at Mr. Harrison, at the countless faces who had been watching him all along, he realized something important. This victory wasn't just about proving his skill as a chess player. It was about proving to himself that no matter what the world threw at him, no matter how many people tried to knock him down or question his worth, he would rise above it. Chess had taught him that every move mattered, that patience and strategy were more powerful than brute force. And now, standing in the spotlight, he understood that life was no different. The world could be unfair, it could be cruel, but Elijah had learned to play the long game. And in the long game, integrity and resilience were always the key to victory. The tournament was over, and Elijah's victory had been celebrated, but the weight of everything that had happened in the days leading up to it still lingered in his mind. The journey back home was quieter, more subdued than the journey to the tournament had been. The clattering of the plane's engines and the occasional chatter of passengers blended into the background as Elijah gazed out the window, his reflection staring back at him against the blue sky. Maya sat next to him, flipping through a magazine without really reading it. Her energy had shifted. She was proud, undeniably so, but there was a gravity to her that hadn't been there before. The incident at the airport was still fresh in her mind, just as it was in Elijah's. The injustice of it gnawed at them both, despite the overwhelming success Elijah had experienced since then. "You know, I was thinking about what Mr. Harrison said," Elijah said softly, breaking the silence. Maya glanced at him. "What part, baby?" "About telling my story, about letting people know what happened." Maya set the magazine down and turned to face him fully. "You don't have to if you don't want to, Eli. You've been through enough." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know, but maybe it's not just about me." He paused, thinking carefully about his next words. "It keeps happening. Not just to me, but to people like me, everywhere. And maybe if people know, if they see what really goes on, it'll help. It might not change everything, but it's something, right?" Maya's eyes softened, a mixture of pride and sorrow reflecting in her gaze. "You're stronger than I ever realized," she said quietly. "You've always been strong, but this is a different kind of strength." Elijah didn't feel particularly strong. He was just tired of carrying the weight of other people's assumptions, tired of pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. But if there was one thing chess had taught him, it was that the long game required patience, persistence, and the willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good. The video of the airport incident had gone viral, just as Mr. Harrison had predicted. By the time they landed back home, Elijah's face had been seen by millions of people. Clips of Officer Briggs searching through Elijah's backpack, questioning him, and treating him like a suspect for no reason were all over the internet, and the public reaction was swift. There was outrage, fury at the blatant racial profiling and at the way Elijah, a child, had been treated. But there was also support, waves of it, from people all over the world. Messages poured in from people who had experienced similar situations, from parents who couldn't imagine their children going through something like that, and from fellow chess players who admired Elijah's composure. Elijah scrolled through some of the comments, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of them. He had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be famous for anything other than his chess skills. But now his face and his story were everywhere. Maya sat next to him, reading some of the messages over his shoulder. "People are really rallying behind you," she said softly. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, I guess they are." He wasn't sure how to feel about it all. On one hand, it was good to know that people cared, that they saw what had happened and were speaking out. But on the other hand, Elijah didn't want to be known as just the boy who got harassed at the airport. He didn't want that to define him. But Maya, as always, seemed to sense what he was feeling. "You're more than what happened to you, Eli. Don't ever forget that. You're a chess player, a thinker, a strategist. That's who you are." Elijah looked up from his phone and smiled faintly. "I know, Mom. I don't want people to only see this." "They won't," Maya assured him. "But what happened to you is part of your story now. And if telling it helps make sure this doesn't happen to someone else, then maybe it's worth it." Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, as she often was. What had happened wasn't something he could just forget, and maybe it wasn't something he should try to forget. But that didn't mean it had to define him. A week after the video went viral, news broke that Officer Briggs had been suspended from his position pending an internal investigation. Elijah had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, he was glad there were consequences for what had happened. But on the other hand, he knew that suspensions and investigations weren't always enough to change things. The world had a long history of letting people like Officer Briggs off the hook, even when they were clearly in the wrong. But this time felt different. The public outcry was too loud to ignore, and more stories of racial profiling and discrimination at the airport began to surface. People were sharing their experiences, demanding accountability, and calling for changes in the way security was handled. Elijah wasn't the only one affected, and that gave him a strange sense of solidarity. As the days passed, the focus shifted from Elijah to the larger issue of systemic discrimination. Elijah watched from the sidelines as his story became part of a much bigger conversation. It wasn't just about him anymore, and he was okay with that. The issue was bigger than him, and it needed to be addressed on a larger scale. Maya, always the protector, kept a close eye on the news, but shielded Elijah from the worst of it. She knew how overwhelming it could be, and she wanted to make sure he didn't lose himself in the noise. But Elijah was handling it better than she expected. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was growing into a young man who understood the world more deeply than most people his age. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Elijah and Maya went for a walk in the park. It was something they used to do often when Elijah was younger, or back when chess was just a hobby and the world seemed a little less complicated. Today, the air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees had started to turn shades of gold and red. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Maya spoke. "How are you feeling about everything?" Elijah thought for a moment before answering. "Better, I think. It's a lot to take in, but I think I'm okay with how things turned out." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You handled it better than most adults would have. I'm proud of you, Eli. I really am." Elijah smiled, but it was a quiet smile. "Thanks, Mom. I didn't want to let them win, you know? I didn't want them to make me feel small." "You never were small," Maya said softly. "You've always been bigger than the world wanted to give you credit for." They stopped by a bench near the edge of the park, where a group of children were playing. One of the kids, a boy around 10 years old, was sitting off to the side, watching the others with a chessboard set up in front of him. Elijah watched for a moment before walking over. "Hey," Elijah said, crouching down next to the boy. "You like chess?" The boy nodded shyly. "Yeah, but no one else here really plays." Elijah smiled. "Mind if I join you?" The boy's face lit up, and soon the two of them were deep into a game, with the other children gathering around to watch. Maya watched from the bench, her heart swelling with pride as she saw Elijah teaching the younger boy moves and strategies. This was who Elijah was, a teacher, a thinker, a quiet force in a world that didn't always know how to appreciate him. He wasn't just a chess prodigy or a boy who had been profiled at an airport. He was someone who had learned how to navigate the complexities of life with grace and resilience, someone who understood that the real game wasn't just played on a board of black and white squares. As the sun set and the game with the young boy drew to a close, Elijah looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of closure. What had happened to him was unfair, but it hadn't broken him. It had made him stronger, more aware of the world's challenges, and more determined to face them head-on. In the end, Elijah knew that the world was full of people like Officer Briggs. People who judged others without knowing them, who acted on fear and ignorance. But there were also people like his mother, like Mr. Harrison, like the strangers who had reached out in support. And there were kids like the boy in the park, waiting for someone to show them how to play the long game. Life, like chess, was about more than just the pieces in front of you. It was about the moves you made, the patience you cultivated, and the lessons you learned along the way. And Elijah, as young as he was, had already mastered the most important lesson of all. No matter what life threw at him, he would always rise above it, one move at a time. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.